Hello, everyone. My name is Ira Idle, and welcome back to the history of the Neurodiversity movement. So, today we're actually going to start talking about the history of the movement itself, starting with the history of Autism Network International. So, here's the timeline of the whole movement up to now. So, we're right now at the beginning, late 80s, early 90s, and this timeline goes to the present. So, there were autism conferences held by parents and professionals that were mainly meant for them, not necessarily for autistic people. They met so autism. However, there were autistic people who attended these conferences, and from that they started a pen pal list, and that pen pal list eventually became the organization Autism Network International, as you can see here. Uh, so these conferences, a lot of the autistic attendants didn't like what was said about them. They were talked about as if their very existence was a tragedy, like that, like they were a problem to be solved, perhaps a puzzle to be solved, as often denoted by the puzzle piece symbol that's used often with regards to autism. And the environment at the conferences was also, it was very hectic. There were fluorescent lights. They were loud, crowded. Um, it just wasn't. It just wasn't the optimal environment for autistic people, but they were still able to meet each other through these conferences, which is important. ANI was started by three people. One of those people was Donna Williams, who was actually born in Australia. She was on a book tour for her book Nobody Nowhere when she met with the other two founders of ANI. She was involved in several organizations, so she was involved in ANI, but she was also involved with the Autism Society of America, Global Regional Asperger Syndrome Partnership, and she was even on the board of Cure Autism Now. So I think she definitely like her alliances are interesting, uh, but she had her work was very important to the foundation of the neurodiversity movement. She was one of the first autistic people to really speak up about their own lives as an autistic person and have actually have a platform. She unfortunately died of cancer in 2016. So next up is Jim Sinclair, so the person who founded ANI and Autry. So Jim is intersex and uses Z-Zim-Zer pronouns. Those are called neopronouns, which actually, among non-binary and gender non-conforming people, those are not used as commonly nowadays as they were back in the 90s and 2000s. But from what I know, Jim's still alive today. Jim still uses those pronouns. A lot of Jim's advocacy before Z was really involved in the autism sphere was with LGBT, with gender sexuality advocacy, and I think Jim also was aware of a lot of other disability movements, and I think from both of those, both of those had a heavy influence on Jim's work within the realm of autism. Zania Grant, also known as Kathy Grant, met Jim and Donna online and then met in person during Donna's book tour. She helped form ANI, and she's also since formed local social groups for autistic people in Denver, Colorado. Jim, Zania, and Donna met in person, and from this, they all felt like they had met somebody from the same planet as them after years of feeling like they were aliens living on a foreign planet. It was the first time they had all felt like they made a meaningful connection to someone. And I know I can attest as an autistic person that I definitely feel that a lot when I'm among other autistic people and when I meet autistic people for the first time versus when I'm around non autistic people, or at least people who aren't knowingly autistic. It's a completely different vibe, and I connect way faster with other autistic people, or even people who are just neurodivergent than with neurotypical people. Here are some quotes from Jim and Donna about their experiences. So Donna said, So she then wrote a book later called Somebody Somewhere. So Nobody Nowhere, she talked about how she felt like an outsider. And then Somebody Somewhere, she wrote after meeting Jim and Zinnia. And she talked about how she felt like she had finally found her people. So despite thousands of miles, our world concepts, strategies, and experiences even came down to having created the same made-up words to describe them. Together, we felt like a lost tribe. Normal is to be in the company of one like oneself. We all had a sense of belonging, of being understood, of being normal. All the things we could not get from others in general. It was so sad to have to leave. Why can't we all live together? We had asked each other at some point or another. And Jim said, "My own recollection of this meeting is a feeling that after a life spent among aliens, I had met someone who came from the same planet as me. We all understood each other. It was an amazing and powerful experience to be able to communicate with someone in my own language. I had sometimes been able to establish a meaningful connection with people before, but it always involved my having to learn other people's language and do constant laborious translating. Here, with people who shared my language, meaning flowed freely and easily." So Jim noticed from the letters they would send each other that Donna had visual fixations from the letters she wrote Jim. So Jim brought shiny, colorful objects that Donna found fascinating, including a kaleidoscope. Donna also told Jim that her favorite stimulus was metallic red, so like the kind of metal that you would find on a can of Coke. From this experience, Jim started noticing more autistic people sharing fixations and stimming thereafter. And I think, yeah, a lot of when autistic people get together, like how Jim, Zania, and Donna did, that is very much what tends to happen. From the start, there was a conflict, which I touched upon in the last part. Debate on whose voice is more important, parents or professionals, or actual autistic people. And this conflict isn't as black and white as perhaps I have made it out to be so far. There are plenty of parents and professionals who are great allies to the neurodiversity movement and autistic people. And I think that most parents of autistic people are very happy to meet autistic adults to get some more insight on what it's like to grow up autistic. There just happens to be a vocal minority of parents who are actively unwilling to listen and want to work against the neurodiversity movement. And they tend to have the loudest voices, and they tend to be in a lot of the neurotypical led organizations that have done the most harm. So, a couple of parents, Rita and Doyle, reached out to autistic people. They saw autistic people as a valuable resource. So, Donna talked to Rita over the phone in the afternoon, and then Doyle met with Zania and Jim at their apartment. They felt like they needed to set boundaries, though, on how much time they had for questions, because it was very exhausting to constantly be asked questions about just about what it's like to exist, I guess. And they established that they were going to set some time for to help the parents and give them advice, but they were also going to set aside time to just spend among each other, because that was very important to them. So Jim and company decided to develop organizations independent of parents that were by and for autistic people. They all lived far away from each other, so they started a pen pal list and a newsletter. What's important here is Jim considered it a network instead of a community. Jim didn't feel like it was wide enough or well connected enough to be considered a community just yet. So it was specific, for that reason, it was called Autism Network International. Autism connections are better made on a person-to-person basis, one at a time, Jim thought, because it's a lot less overwhelming that way than meeting a bunch of people at once. So, who are we, or who were they? They had to define their membership was. So were they only autistic people, or were parents and professionals allowed too? And on what terms were parents and professionals allowed? What rules would they have to follow? Was it would they only allow high-functioning autistic people or all autistic people? So Jim, Zania, and Donna thought about this and how they their they were at the time considered high-functioning. And I'm sure Jim and Zania are still considered high-functioning by many people, but as children, they were considered low functioning. I know that Jim actually didn't speak until Z was 12 years old. Um, so they figured that functioning labels aren't really accurate. They don't really say much about any one autistic person's needs or strengths, weaknesses, anything like that. They just aren't particularly useful. So they decided that they were going to be for all autistic people. Zania started sending messages to all the neurotypical run autism organizations she could find. Donna spread word about ANI through her book tour, and Jim posted announcements online. The first issue of Our Voice, which was a collective of essays written by autistic people, was published in November of 1992. There are some remnants of Our Voices that you can find online if you dig enough, but the full Our Voices magazine is not publicly available. Hopefully it will someday, and if I ever get my hands on it, I'm going to make sure I share it, given that I have permission to, because I'm sure there's a lot of very foundational stuff from that newsletter that's important important to preserve. Even though it was ran by autistic people, most of the subscribers were parents, and the neurotypical run organizations actually gave hostile responses to this email list, to ANI. Jim assumed that their interests would be the same. These are organizations claim, about autism and, that talk about autism, therefore autistic people by extension, so logically autistic people should be the ones to lead that conversation, or should at least a very important part of the conversation. But they just most of the organizations ran by neurotypical people just didn't like what they only found use in autistic people who would say things that they agreed with about autism, who didn't really challenge their preconceived notions, who agreed with them rather than autistic people who were thinking for themselves. So responses were either indifferent, they just didn't care, or empty. They just gave very baseline encouragement with no actual help. And there was only one parent organization that advertised, and one professional who arranged a session for autistic people to meet each other. When autistic people found each other and worked together, the neurotypicals either didn't care or they didn't like it and would try and ruin it for them actively. The Autism Society of America had a conference in 1991 that many autistic people attended. The non-autistic presenters seemed pleased with what the autistic people had to say, which drew attention to the board of directors of the Autism Society of America. So they decided that they were going to form an autistic advisory board. They promised that one autistic representative from that board would be at each board meeting. They would help plan their 1992 conference, give them space in the Autism Society newsletter, and the Autism Society didn't keep any of these promises. Now today, the Autism Society of America is still around. They do have an autistic advisory board, but they didn't deliver on it when they had promised it back in 1991. They assumed that autistic people couldn't organize their own things because they're autistic. Even though autistic people already had started doing so. So like I said earlier, most parents they met wanted to hear from autistic people. They were most interested in advice for kids, obviously. They weren't hostile like the Autism Society had been, at least for the most part. And autistic people working in their own interests were a threat. Years later, Jim learned that this was common for people with other disabilities, that there were three common tactics found to discredit them. One, deny that the people are members of the group they claim to represent. Oh, you're faking your disability. Number two, if there is evidence that they're a member, claim that they're a rare exception. Oh, well, you're not that disabled. You're not like those other people over there. And three, claim the activists are unable to understand what's happening to them. So you have a disability, therefore you are unable to perceive things logically or whatever, which is obviously like very steeped in ableism. Jim got a call about ANI from a woman named Katherine French, who had just been diagnosed with autism as an adult. She met with Jim in St. Louis, Missouri, and she described that meeting as life-changing. She felt the same way that Zania and Donna felt when they met with Jim. It may have, and as I alluded to earlier, it may have been best that ANI grew at a steady pace rather than a bunch of people at once. Eventually, ANI did develop into a community, much to Jim's surprise. Jim didn't think it was ever going to get this big. The routes to a gathering were online, parent-oriented forums, and at conferences. So in the online parent forum, participation by autistic people was mostly narrative descriptions and receiving questions from parents. So what I mean by narrative descriptions is like telling your whole life story or just giving very specific details about what it's like to be autistic, which we'll get more into in the next part, the next episode. But as more autistic people participated, there was also more one-to-one communication between autistic people. And the autistic people who met in the forums started to meet in person. So from that, more autistic people started showing up to these autism conferences. ANI began, as a group, began to exhibit at conferences. They would have a booth that people could go to, and it was seen as a kind of home base for autistic attendance. Autistic people also found places to gather after hours. They would gather in pairs and small groups, find quiet places. If somebody owned a hotel room, then many autistic people would spend the night there, mostly sleeping on the floor, which is actually very common at conferences and conventions, even nowadays. Live contact was not of interest to all autistic people. Some autistic people decided that they preferred to stay online. For those interested, though, there was a powerful will to make contact. So ANI had an exhibit table at a conference in 1994 in St. Louis, Missouri. Doyle was able to arrange for a group to camp indoors. They found this big office building with this empty floor where 8 adults, as well as Rita and Doyle's son, spent the weekend. So reality check. So with this growing group, there also came a taste of reality. Autistic people, like any other group, are not all alike. This means that there is conflict among autistic people. Not all autistic people like each other. I can most certainly attest to that from personal experience. ANI is not what every autistic person wanted or needed. It served a specific purpose, and not every autistic person was interested in that purpose. And the characteristics of ANI resulted from those who participated. So there were plenty of autistic people who, for one reason or another, didn't participate in ANI, either because they didn't want to or because they didn't know it was a thing. There were still many autistic people living in group homes, institutions, who didn't have internet access because the internet was still new at the time. It wasn't kind of a guaranteed thing like it is nowadays. And of course, there were certain populations of autistic people who weren't diagnosed, where just autism wasn't even talked about. most of the people who participated in ANI were white, partially because of those reasons that I listed. So some of those principles that they formed were that it's okay to be autistic. They weren't as political as other autism groups, though they were still strictly aligned with the disability rights movement. This was a few years after the Americans with Disabilities Act had been signed into law, and so I think some of the participants in ANI are part of what Rebecca Coakley calls the ADA generation. Though I think the adults at this time maybe not so much because they grew up before the ADA was a thing. But there was still probably the younger people definitely would be considered part of the ADA generation. Uh, Accommodating the sensory needs of everyone was hard. Like, for example, if one autistic person doesn't like loud noises, and there's another autistic person who has a hard time controlling the volume of their voice, that can create an imbalance. And I myself am both of those things, so it's kind of, and I think a lot of autistic people are too. They were not a separate community, so anyone who just wanted to be with autistic people and not parents or not non-autistic people were going to be disappointed because there was engagement with those people. And participants did not have to form relationships with others if they did not wish to. There were some people who were very eager to meet other autistic people and form friendships. Other people just wanted to keep to themselves. In 1993 and 1994, several critical events happened that led to the true birth of the neurodiversity movement. Most of these we're going to talk about in the next episode. But the main one we're going to talk about today is Don't Mourn for Us. So there are also the ideas of strangers and cousins, the snore wars, ANIL, which I'm going to get into all of those in the next part. But Don't Mourn for Us is considered the speech that started it all, the manifesto of the neurodiversity movement. It was presented at the Autism Society of Ontario's 1993 conference, so that's Canada. It was rejected from the Autism Society of America's conference, though the people in Ontario were okay with it. So it challenged the thought of autism as a tragedy and drew a lot more interest towards ANI. Right here is a visualization with a small snippet of of Don't Mourn for Us. It was made by this user, Miss Luna Rose. So, autism is a way of being. It is pervasive. It colors every experience, every sensation, perception, thought, emotion, and encounter, every aspect of existence. So, we're going to leave it at that. And we'll continue in the next part, talk about the formation of ANIL and the conference Autreat. So I'll see you then.